It's time to look at some tiny PCs, but smaller than that. Smaller than that. Okay, now that's tiny, and it runs Windows. Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. Today in Dave's Garage, we're going to look at 5 different mini PCs, ranging from tiny to merely small. We'll start with the most compact and proceed on to the most powerful, up to and including a 14-core i9 with a 3080 Ti, but they all share one thing in common: they're small. The CPUs and GPUs involved will vary widely, and spoiler alert, the best PCs for gaming aren't always the smallest form factor, as you might guess. At the higher end, we'll find GPUs that can play modern games at generous frame rates, but when it comes to the smallest of the small, well, I hope you like Minecraft. And that's why I'll be giving you the benchmark numbers for each, and we'll cover what the various form factors are actually capable of. The first PC we'll look at has been around for a while now, the ZimaBoard. This model features the Intel Celeron N3450, a quad-core CPU with a base clock of 1.1 GHz and a turbo of 2.2, which makes it more than capable of running a robust Linux installation. It can also run Windows. It would be great for Pi-hole, pfSense, DNS, and perfect for whatever Docker containers you can dream up. Why mess with Raspberry Pis when you can have full x64 support in a form factor that's only marginally larger? The Zima comes in 3 configs known as the 232, the 432, and the 832, with the first digit indicating the amount of RAM in gigabytes, 2, 4, or 8. I've got the top spec ZimaBoard 832 here, which also features 4 CPU cores on its passively cooled Intel Celeron Apollo Lake chip, the N3450. With a turbo of 2.2 GHz, it's not a computational powerhouse, but it's more than adequate for running Linux and various tools and packages that could be found there. It can also run Windows, but mine came with Casa OS, a Debian-based distribution, so that's what I kept on it. The Zima has a few unique features, not the least of which is an external PCIe 2x4 slot on the side. The slot affords you the opportunity to run a full PCIe card externally, like this OCZ SSD that I've plugged into it for testing. In theory, you could add a more powerful GPU, a higher speed network adapter, or pretty much anything else you can dream up. The Zima also has great connectivity, featuring dual SATA ports on the end that allow you to connect drives directly to it. They include a cable that allows you to tap power off that end as well, so nothing external is required. It also has dual 1 gigabit Ethernet ports, dual USB 3 ports, and somewhat oddly, a mini DisplayPort connector that can handle up to 4K 60. It supports the transcoding of up to 1080p formats and can decode H.264 and H.265 in hardware. I put the Zima through its paces by running the console version of Geekbench 6. The same test will apply to each of the systems today to get a fair comparison between them. And the Zima scored a single-core score of 271 and a quad-core result of 840. On the GPU compute side, it scored 843, and so those numbers will serve as our baseline as we move up the progression. And speaking of which, the next PC we'll check out is the smallest of the bunch, the Pantera Pico PC from XDO. Little side note, I couldn't tell which way their logo went, and I didn't have any other documentation, so when I first hooked it up to a tiny display, I thought it was OCX, and so I wound up flipping the display upside down internally in Windows settings until I figured out, no, it's XDO. This adorable little PC features Intel's J4125 quad-core chip at 2.7 GHz. It sports 8 GB of LPDDR4 memory and an M2 SSD, which in my case is a 256 GB unit. The J4125 and the XDO Pico is similar to the older Celeron and the Zima, but sports a higher base clock of 2 versus 1.1 GHz and a higher boost clock of 2.7 compared to the old 2.2. The internal GPU goes from the Intel HD 500 in the Zima to the HD 600 in the Pico, but the graphics performance differences should be negligible. The Pico does pick up H.265 10-bit and VP9 encoding in hardware. TDP increases to 10 watts from the Zima's 6, but in both cases, that's tiny. The Pico has dual-band Wi-Fi, meaning it supports both the 2.4 and 5 GHz bands, but no Wi-Fi 6 yet. And the one curious omission is the lack of an RJ45 network port. XDO provided a USB dongle that features 3 more USB ports as well as the network jack, and though it's only a gigabit connection, it works well. It also offloads the keyboard and mouse cables onto the dongle as well, so it actually tidies up the wiring rather than cluttering it further. The Pico has a standard audio jack and has been upgraded to a copper heatsink with an internal fan. While the Zima's cooling was entirely passive, the Pico uses a copper heatsink. This fan is generally pretty quiet until there's any significant load placed on the CPU or GPU, at which point it spins up to a fairly low level, but the fan is small enough that the RPMs are high enough that the pitch can be a bit annoying. Here's an example. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Pico PC is the accessories that are available for it, making it into a useful travel PC for anything other than serious gaming. There's a small projector that would be ideal for camping or situations where a TV isn't available, as well as a folding Bluetooth keyboard and a rather adorable little mouse. The Pico is available in a wide range of colors, and it's an attractive design. The LED bar on the top is blue regardless of the PC's body color. The Pico sports 4 USB ports, not including the little hub that came with it, 3 of which are USB 3 and the other is USB 2. In terms of performance, the Pico is in about the same class as the Zima, but thanks to the newer generation CPU with a higher boost clock, and perhaps due to the cooling system, we see a small jump in the numbers. The Pico manages a best single-core score of 352 and a multi-core score of 997. So close. The CPU compute score was a touch lower than the Zima, however, coming in at 794. Now keep in mind the Zima is running the console version of Geekbench under Linux, whereas the Pico is running the graphical version under Windows. Shouldn't make a difference, but on an 8GB system it might be memory constrained, and so it might have impact. Since we're under Windows, we can throw Cinebench R23 into the mix, and the Pico scored 444. I still think you should look at this as being somewhat amazing that a form factor like this can even run something like Cinebench, even if the score is low. How low is it? Well, that 444, for comparison at the other end of the scale, you can look at my new Threadripper 7995WX, which scores over 100,000. So that's quite a delta. So you won't get rich mining Bitcoin on a Pico, that much is certain. It's got media encoding and decoding built in, but there's one problem. I couldn't get it to reliably play back 4K 60 content on YouTube, as it would drop about 8 of the frames each second. That was on a hardwired Ethernet connection, not Wi-Fi, so it seems the limitation is actually the ability to decode and push enough bits to the screen. In summary then, if you have a scenario that doesn't require a lot of CPU and that generally operates headlessly, either the Zima or the Pico should suffice. The Zima is more expandable and the Pico has a smaller, more durable form factor, so it really depends on your scenario as to which one would be the better choice for you. But what if you need more? What if you want something that's actually usable as a desktop, can play media, and even do some gaming? Well, I've got good news, because with just a tiny bump up in size, we can pick up a lot of power. Let's have a look at the Xulu XR1, which brings the Ryzen 8 CPU to the table with 8 cores and 16 threads. It features up to 64GB of LPDDR4 RAM, built-in Wi-Fi 6E, 7 USB ports, 3 of which are USB 2. It's got an M2 slot and replaceable RAM, so it's upgradable as well, although it's a bear to work on because internally it has edge connectors that go to ribbon connectors of the foil kind that have to be inserted into these pretty fragile connectors, so taking it apart is an adventure. It also features a USB-C port that does support video. The Xulu supports a 7nm Ryzen 5800U CPU, which doubles our core count to 8 and, more importantly, ups the turbo frequency to a substantial 4.4 GHz. This is essentially one of AMD's laptop chips, and the integrated graphics are still just integrated graphics, but they're a significant step up from the Zima and the Pico. Shader core is about quadruple to 512, and the clock speed is about double as well. There are dual HDMI ports as well as that USB-C, so 3 monitors can be connected at 4K 60. Better yet, the Xulu had no trouble with 4K 60 playback on YouTube, and once the stream was established, no further frames were ever dropped. For me, the Xulu hits the point at which it becomes an actual usable desktop PC, and it's still such a tiny form factor that I think it's perfect for throwing into your travel bag for connection to a hotel TV, for example. In fact, there's only one thing that disappointed me on the Xulu, and that's the fact that you can't power it by USB-C power delivery. See, my Dell monitor has a USB-C KVM and power supply built in, so with things like the Latte Panda Sigma, you can connect everything to the monitor with a single USB-C cable. It not only powers the computer, but it connects the USB channel to the keyboard and mouse that are in turn connected to the monitor. But while the Xulu doesn't support power over USB-C, if you hook up its supplied power adapter, you can then plug the USB-C cable into the monitor. The USB keyboard and mouse and video all work as expected, and that even leaves 2 more HDMI ports available, so it appears, as I said, the Xulu can handle 3 monitors at once this way. The Xulu also features a small OLED display, the most prominent part being a clock that auto-sets based on network time and your local time zone setting. In other words, it was just right and I never had to set it. I thought this display was kind of a useless feature at first, but since they've added both fan speed and system temperature to the display, it's actually quite handy, and I find myself checking it off, and particularly when the system is under load. While not entirely silent, I don't recall ever really noticing the fan much, and it seems to run at a lower speed than the Pico, so it's less distracting when it does spool up. In terms of raw performance, the Xulu sails past the Pico with a single-core score of 1894 and a multi-core score of 6493. The GPU compute score comes in at 16,092, which should serve as an indication that the Xulu XR1 is capable of playing most mid-range titles, from Counter-Strike on up, but for current titles like Starfield and Cyberpunk, you're going to be at 1080 or 1440p and low to medium settings to get a respectable frame rate, but we'll play them. Our next two machines really up the ante for power, and the first step comes up with just another small incremental increase in size. The Herk Orion Mini PC. Moving up to the Orion brings us a Ryzen 9 CPU, the 7940HS. Sporting 8 cores and 16 threads, it features a 4 GHz base clock with a boost clock of 5.2 GHz. The unit can be equipped with up to 64 GB of LPDDR5 SODIMM RAM. It uses a proper vapor chamber cooler with a fan and is running a 1TB NVMe SSD. Since there are two M.2 slots in there, you have one completely open in the base config. Inside the beautiful aluminum case, the Orion supports Wi-Fi 6 and has a 2.5 gigabit LAN port, which I was able to verify with iPerf up to a consistent 2.37 gigabits in the real-world usage. There are dual USB 3 ports, dual USB 2 ports, and better yet, dual USB 4 ports. The unit ships with a 140-watt power supply, and the CPU has a TDP of 65, though with some tinkering it can likely go as high as 90. For graphics, the Orion sports the Radeon 780M RDNA 3 graphics, and the GPU is running at a sprightly 2.8 GHz. It can also boost to 3, but I couldn't verify that. Total graphics power comes in at 54 watts, and it uses a 4nm process in the manufacturing. In terms of benchmarks, the Orion turns in a single-core score of 2672 and a multi-core score of 13,332 in Geekbench 6. That's actually the highest multi-core score we'll see today. On the GPU compute side, it achieves a score of 32,567, about double what we saw in the Xulu. Those numbers would indicate that the Orion should be an actual contender for 3D gameplay, and indeed, it can play Starfield at 720p low settings at a solid 60 FPS. Spider-Man, which is a slightly less demanding title, manages 70 to 80 FPS at 1080p, while Forza approaches 120 frames per second at similar settings. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p low settings also manages to keep up with a 60Hz VSync, making for a useful and enjoyable experience in a very small package. But what if you need more? What if you need a level of gaming performance that you're simply not able to get, at least not yet, in an integrated package? At that point, you're going to need a discrete GPU, but have you seen the size of a Founders Edition card lately? They're huge and would completely negate the whole point of these compact packages. So what to do? Well, enter the tank from Ace Magic. While it's the largest unit we'll look at today, it's still compact for what it brings to the table, including an i9-12900H CPU and a 3080 Ti GPU. The 12900 features 14 cores and 20 total threads distributed across 6 performance cores with multi-threading and 8 economy cores without. The base clock is 3.8 GHz with a boost clock of 5 GHz. For the maximum power of 115 watts, it features 24 megabytes of on-die CPU cache as well. Because the 12900 features Intel's Xe integrated graphics, you actually have 2 GPUs. But it's the NVIDIA 3080 that is the star of the show. Now, it's actually the laptop variant of the GPU, which is cut down in specs to a certain degree, but still much more powerful than the integrated graphics we've seen on all of the other units so far. In the synthetic benchmarks, the tank turns in a single-core score of 2,523 and a multi-core score of 12,055, very close to what we saw in the Herk Orion. And there should be little surprise that it finds itself at the top for GPU performance with a Geekbench 6 GPU compute score of 122,764. For comparison, I plugged an AMD 5700 XT into the Thunderbolt 4 port of one of the other systems, and I was able to hit 69,579, meaning that the tank still more than doubles the performance of my standard external GPU setup. For comparison, my Threadripper with an NVIDIA 4080 scores 222,000, so the tank scores a bit better than half as much as a contemporary full-size 4080, an impressive achievement given the size. The front of the tank has a large knob that I initially figured was just a useless gewgaw for adjusting the volume or the lighting or some such thing, but it turns out to be a highly useful feature. It controls the CPU performance mode and allows you to select from 3 levels that they're calling Quiet, Normal, and Beast Mode. A simple twist of the knob can quiet the fans or boost performance for gaming as the situation dictates. The tank features dual 2.5 gigabit LAN ports as well as Wi-Fi 6. It can support a total of 4 4K 60 displays and is equipped with a 1TB NVMe SSD as well as an open second slot. The sodium RAM operates at 4800 megatransfers per second in dual-channel mode. The tank also supports Thunderbolt 4 on its dual USB-C ports, allowing you to connect external peripherals like this 10 gigabit network adapter with ease. In this case, the tank powers the adapter over the USB-C port as well, so it makes for easy single-cable connections to a wide range of peripherals. Unfortunately, as with the Xulu, the tank doesn't support being powered over USB-C, so you must still use the supplied adapter. Once powered, however, the USB-C connection can be used to connect to a monitor KVM and will route the mouse and keyboard as well as video, so you can be set up with just power and a single cable. Those 2 ports support the full 40 gigabit spec as well. In terms of real-world gaming, the tank exceeds 100 frames per second in Forza Horizon 5 at 1440p. God of War can be run at 1440p ultra settings and will still hit the mid-70s for a frame rate. Staying at 1440p, Spider-Man manages an easy 120 FPS. To really push the unit, we ran Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440 Ultra with ray tracing enabled and no frame generation, and consistently exceeded 75 FPS. I think that gives it some legitimate gaming cred amongst any reasonably portable systems. There was only one thing that bugged me about the tank, and that was the driver stack. Because it's a laptop GPU, you need the driver specific to the 3080 laptop chip, but that's an OEM chip, and NVIDIA doesn't publish on their website drivers for the OEM stuff. Ace Magic supplied a driver, but the installer was in Chinese, so I don't think it's quite done yet. It worked well enough, though, up until we tried playing New World on Steam when the anti-cheat engine repeatedly kicked us out. The driver does seem to be signed, and the search chain looks to be valid, but New World was having none of it. That's the only game that I had an issue with, but it worries me somewhat, and I recommend that you check to see in advance whether any particular game that you're passionate about is fully compatible if it uses anti-cheat. Let's round up all the numbers and draw some conclusions. Here are the final scores, as you can see that there's quite a range. I would say that if you need a headless unit that you don't interact with a lot, the Zima and the Pico fit the bill. But if you plan to actually use the machine as a desktop interactively, I'd recommend stepping up to the Xulu XR1. Which is the point at which performance really becomes acceptable for daily use. And if you're looking for a lot more CPU power but don't have intense gaming needs, then the Herk Orion is my favorite. The Ryzen 9 CPU really brings a lot of computational horsepower with it, and if the 780 graphics fit your needs, I think it's the perfect package. If, however, AAA gaming is on the agenda, then the tank is your only real solution. It's not as tiny as the others, but it still looks to be around the 1 liter mark, at least in apparent size. With a full laptop class 3080 NVIDIA GPU, it might just be your new best friend at your next LAN party. Remember that I'm mostly in this for the subs and likes, and so if you found today's episode to be any combination of entertaining or informative, I'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing to my channel and turning on all notifications so that you get alerted to future episodes. If you have any interest in matters related to autism, Asperger's, or ASD, please check out the free sample of my book on Amazon using the link in the video description. It's everything I know now about autism and ASD that I wish I'd known way back then. Thanks for joining me out here in the shop today. In the meantime and in between time, hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.